Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking another look at the Zero Cero. I'll be showing you my baseline setup. Everything I do after the car is fully built and all the electronics are installed, but before it ever hits the track. You may find a few surprises in here, or maybe you do things completely differently. This is simply the process that works for me. You don't have to follow it exactly, but hopefully you'll pick up a few useful tips along the way. So let's get started with step 1. Once the car is fully assembled, the first thing I do is put it on the scales and check the weight distribution. If anything looks off, I'll make adjustments before moving on. In my case, I'm using the same components as in my other cars, so I was already fairly confident the balance would be close. And the Zero Cero is actually very well designed from a layout perspective. I was able to transfer my usual setup almost one-to-one. One tip I can give you is this. Depending on the battery capacity or battery weight you're running, it's worth shimming the motor about 1 to 1.5 millimeters further outboard. In my case, I moved the motor 1 millimeter outward, and that gave me an excellent starting point. With that done, you already have a very solid baseline configuration. When you put the car back on the scales, the results look like this. Here you can see the weight distribution between the front and rear, as well as the left and right sides of the car. Honestly, there's not much to complain about. For a car that's basically built straight out of the kit, this is an excellent starting point. Once the weight distribution is where I want it, it's time for step 2, setting the droop. For me, droop is one of the most important setup adjustments on the entire car. It's one of the biggest tuning tools you have for adapting the suspension to different track conditions. What's interesting is that even very small changes can make a noticeable difference on the track. My advice is to experiment with it. Try different droop settings and pay close attention to how the car reacts. The more experience you gain, the better you'll understand what each adjustment does. That knowledge becomes incredibly valuable during a race when track conditions change and you need to make quick setup decisions. Now let's take a look at how I set the droop. There are several different methods depending on the setup system you're using. I'm using the MR33 setup tools. First, I remove the wheels and place the chassis on 10 mm setup blocks. Make sure you're working on a perfectly flat surface, ideally a setup board or a glass plate. Next, I install the droop collar on the wheel axle and use the gauge to measure the droop accurately. You'll find this setup parameter on the setup sheet under downstop. That's where your droop values are recorded. Don't be confused if your numbers don't match the values shown in the manual. The difference isn't because the setup is wrong. It's simply because a different style of droop gauge is being used. The manual uses one type of gauge, while I'm using a different version with a different scale. I'll set the droop using my gauge and also tell you the equivalent values for the other style. So no matter which gauge you're using, you'll be able to match the settings without any problems. Now it's time to set the droop. To do this, place the measuring gauge directly underneath the spacer ring mounted on the wheel axle. As my baseline, I run 23.6 on the front axle. This is simply a setting that has worked very well for me over time. You adjust it using the set screw in the suspension arm. Turning the screw in raises the suspension arm and increases the measured value. Turning it out lowers the arm, resulting in a smaller measurement. If you're using the other style of droop gauge, 23.6 corresponds to approximately 6.2. For the rear axle, I use 22.8, which equals roughly 5.4 on the other gauge. This combination gives me a very solid baseline that I can fine-tune later depending on the track layout and available grip. Now let's move on to the next step. Camber and toe. If you're using adjustable upper suspension arms, make sure you adjust the caster at the same time whenever you change their length. Since we're using the fixed upper arms here, we can focus entirely on camber and toe. For my setup, I'm using this setup station from Aeromax. I have the more affordable version, which allows me to work on one axle at a time. I always start with the front axle. To do that, I place the rear axle on 10 mm setup blocks. After mounting the setup station, I switch on both the transmitter and the car, then adjust the steering turnbuckles. Using the supplied wrench, I adjust the turnbuckles until both sides are perfectly symmetrical. My baseline setting is 0.5 degrees of front toe out. Of course, this assumes that both steering links have been built to exactly the same length. Mine measure 25.75 mm between the rod ends. Next, I adjust the front camber by turning the camber turnbuckle. My target is minus 1.5 degrees of camber. Once the front is complete, I move the setup station to the rear axle. There, I set 2.5 degrees of rear toe in and minus 1.0 degree of rear camber. At this point, the major setup work is done. The final step is setting the ride height. I reinstall the wheels, place the car back on the setup board, and measure the distance between the bottom of the chassis and the setup board. For the rear, I run 5.5 mm of ride height. This is adjusted by changing the spring preload on the shock absorbers. At the front, I set the ride height to 5.4 mm. And that's it. The basic setup is complete and the car is ready for the track. I'm really looking forward to the first test session. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what setup you like to run or what your preferred settings are for the Zero Cero. Thanks for watching and I'll see you at the track.